GLOBIS.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to the panel on geopolitics. The topic for discussion is US-China hegemony in Asia. And we have a terrific lineup of panelists today, so I hope we have a great discussion here. What I would like to do today is, first of all, pitch questions to the panelists and do a sort of a back and forth, maybe for a couple of rounds, and then open up the floor for Q&A with the floor. So just to give you a sort of a brief background to the issue, I think one of the main features of the change in the strategic landscape in the so-called Indo-Pacific region has become the shift in the US approach towards China, from strategic cooperation to strategic competition. And I think a lot of attention is being paid to the so-called trade war with the action-reaction dynamic using tariffs as a means to pressure the other side to compromise. But I think we should also pay attention to the fact that there are other dimensions to the US-China competition. In my view, there appears to be generally two kinds of US-China competition. First, there is the bilateral technological competition to apply advanced technologies for building the next generation of military power, industrial power, and information power, if you will. The US-China competition has coincided with the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, or near-simultaneous breakthrough in cutting-edge technologies. And as a result, US-China competition essentially hinges on the question of who will lead and effectively apply advanced technologies for military, industrial, and data communication purposes in order to become a 21st century type hegemon. Second, I think there is also a geopolitical competition over influence in third countries that are taking at least 3 or maybe 4 forms. And those are maritime competition, infrastructure financing competition, and digital network competition. And I think the question of what is going to happen to the South China Sea, how should other states relate to or face China's Belt and Road Initiative, and how should we deal with the data communication technologies like 5G are all quite salient issues these days. So it is not just about industrial and economic policy, but there are also military, informational, and geopolitical dimensions to the US-China competition. Now, I'm not sure how much ground we'll be able to cover, but we have a terrific lineup of panelists today, so I'm sure we will have a great discussion. So now I would like to dive right into the discussion by starting with a question for Abe. Abe, could you please start off by maybe explaining to us what Washington's China strategy is? You know, some experts have said that there is really no coherent China strategy, and there are probably differences between President Trump's game plan and the strategy preferred by the bureaucracy in Congress. And even among Washington policy experts and government officials, there might be different schools of thought about how to face China, as we have seen in the recent Washington Post open letter signed by 90-some academics and professionals who suggested an alternative approach towards China. So would you like to maybe start off by sharing your views on Washington's China strategy?
Sure. It's a very helpful question, Hori-san. And first, thank you to Ji-Wan, to Hori-san, for inviting me to speak. It's a real honor for me to be here and to be with so many friends on this panel. I think the United States, fundamentally, is in the middle of probably the most highly consequential debate about foreign policy that we've had since the end of the Cold War. And that applies to a wide variety of foreign policy issues, including China. Now, for a few years, there was a conventional wisdom about where the United States was headed in terms of foreign policy, that the election of President Trump signaled that the United States, that the American people were tired of endless wars. They wanted to pull back. They wanted to reduce the American role in the world. They were skeptical of trade, skeptical of multilaterals, skeptical of alliances. Now, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs recently published a survey of the American people, which showed pretty definitively that that conventional wisdom was wrong, dead wrong, that a large majority of Americans across the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, support the United States playing an active role in the world, support alliances, support trade. In fact, in those 3 categories, more Americans were supportive of an active role for the United States than had been in the history of that survey. So I think we see that the United States, the American people, are still very engaged in this. We can dig into those numbers if people are interested. But in terms of where the debate is on China, I think that feeds into where we are. That there's a pretty significant disagreement, both inside and outside the US government, about the nature of the China challenge and therefore how to address it. But there's a general agreement, I think, in the beginning that the old approach, what some people call the engagement approach, is insufficient, that it has not achieved the objectives that we would like. So the question is, what do we replace it with? There are some people who see things as a clash of civilizations, that the United States and China are embroiled in this structural competition, and they see dynamics in very zero-sum terms. There's others, you mentioned the open letter, that several people in Washington, including some of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, penned in the Washington Post, talking about the need for engagement, the need to support moderates in China, and the need to step away from a more confrontational approach that the Trump administration is. But I think there's a middle position forming, where I think the majority of American policymakers, both in Democrat and Republican circles, will tend to gravitate towards. And it's a question of how do we balance competition and cooperation, that I think that this approach is forming on. In terms of competition, we're trying to ask questions, what are we actually trying to compete over? The Trump administration, I think, has done a good job of identifying competition as a driving force in the relationship, but it's unclear what we're competing over. And then how do we think about competition within this context? And I think broadly what we're looking at is that competition is going to intensify, but it's possible that at the same time, cooperation may intensify as well. And this is a flip from how we've talked about these dynamics in the past. You used to hear a lot of people, both inside and outside of the US government, talking about the need to find the right balance between competition and cooperation. And I think what you're saying is it's the idea that these two are in opposition to each other. But what I think you're going to see in the coming years is that both are going to intensify simultaneously. But it's a question of how do Americans think about this that I think is mostly going to change. And I'm going to stop on this point because I know we're trying to be quick. There used to be a belief amongst some policymakers in Washington that engagement with China was a positive development in itself, that an objective of the United States should be to have a good, positive, constructive relationship with China. And I think instead, it's going to be much more focused on mutual interests, that the United States and China can and should cooperate with each other, but in areas where our interests overlap, be it climate change, be it counterproliferation, other issues in which we both have an interest. That doing so is not something that China does as a favor to the United States. It's not something that China can do that would limit what the United States may be doing in other competitive aspects, but rather it's a sign of a much more complex coexistence between the United States and China, in which we're both cooperating and competing with them at the same time. I think I'll stop there, but how that interacts and what cooperation and competition looks like in that arena, I think is something that requires a lot more thought and engagement.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to ask now Dao Zhong about China's perspective, and could you perhaps please explain to us your views on China's strategy in managing the current tension with the United States? I think in the short run, President Xi probably needs to think about managing the risks arising from the tariffs without compromising China's core industrial policies, such as state subsidies that form the backbone of the Chinese Communist Party's governance. But if this non-agreement situation continues and intensifies the competition, how do you think that would affect China's trajectory of national development? This is a big question, I realize, but what do you think are China's strengths and weaknesses in facing US pressure on a wide range of issues? I'd appreciate if you could provide us with your insights on that kind of question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One way to answer your question is to look at the positive momentum that's gathering virtually over last week when both sides are walking back on tariffs. And there may be a what's called a mini agreement coming up, partial agreement on trade. And then you have the structural matters to be dealt with later on. So in terms of the trade investment relationship, a good deal of, should I say, pragmatism is settling in on both sides. So that's that. You know, this is the 40th year of China. You can call it the opening to the outside world or what else. It's the first time when China as a civilization, as a country, has had 40 years of non-stop peaceful interactions with the rest of the world. We as scholars do a lot of thinking about it. And one of the things that strikes me as a scholar, including these kind of exchanges, is, my goodness, exactly how antagonistic is this relationship, set of relationship between China and the rest of the world. A lot of times it's a matter of how we construct or frame this ourselves. If you listen to this mainstream international relations theorization, such as this trap talk, Thucydides, it's destined. There's no escape. When you listen to official rhetoric, or you can call it propaganda, then you have nation building, you have things that are meant for domestic consumption. Sometimes you have lost in translation. But a lot of times when you look at the performance of it, the end result may not be as negative, right? So what is it, the antagonism? Is this so-called fight over primacy or supremacy? Somebody has to be number one, whatever in this world. Or is this specific policy? Every policy has a context, and then, or is it what's called the behaviors by some of these alliance members? So we have to put it in context. And a lot of times we forget, at the end of the day, how little, that's the right choice of the word. Either the US factor is, having on Chinese this or that, or Chinese behavior is having on the US. In other words, these are two heavy 800-pound gorillas. They each rise and fall under their own weight. How much of a factor is the other side? That's something we have to think about as we move on to the next 40 years, should we say. Now, for China, one of the things we ought to be walking back in terms of rhetoric is what eventually is the purpose of China as a nation. I would list two that's often not as highlighted. These two add up to one thing. I'll come to that one thing later on. The first purpose is to avoid getting into what's called the middle income trap. And it's very difficult. Over the past 150 years, frankly speaking, only one nation succeeded in doing that. A second purpose is, not many Chinese would say it, but it's something we have to be saying it louder to ourselves, is to avoid being a burden on the rest of the world. I constantly think about the 1993, 1992, when you have boatloads of Chinese economic migrants showing up on the shores of New York and under the name of wanting to be in a more democratic society. Is that the kind of China we want? No. Now, if you put these 2 points together, the purpose of China is not to compete against the United States here or there, is not to put either with the South China Sea or its cyber or infrastructure in any sort of binary mode. The US has a life to live, so does China. So in that sense, I'm not as sad about what's going on between the two countries. It's sort of like a dating relationship. 40 years is a blip of time in terms of long history. The interactions between our two countries are still very shallow. So momentarily, we kind of step back from the kind of agony that's saying, you know, is the other side shortchanging me? And maybe you do see a fence somewhere. Proper fences do make good neighbors. So in that, I think that's how I would characterize how I personally feel about it. And, but one last point before my time shows up. In terms of the negotiations, the trade, you know, you wonder why these two big countries, two huge governments armed with these teams of smart people, and the first and second largest economy of the world, what is it that after some 13, 14 rounds of negotiations still cannot come up to an agreement? I would think, especially on our side over there in China, it's very important to separate the substance from the style of what may come across as bitter pill demands from either the United States or the European Union or another entity. This is not, you need to do the kind of right things. You may not appear politically, do this politically costly in terms of rhetoric or gesturing, but the end of the day, it's the performance that matters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have sort of a general sense of the U.S. and the Chinese perspective. So I just want to shift a little bit and get the perspective from third countries, you know, how the U.S.-China competition is impacting other regions and states. And I want to ask Lin a question about, you know, what would be your general sense of how Southeast Asian nations are viewing the intensification of the U.S.-China rivalry? You know, my understanding is that general position held by many regional states has been, you know, don't make us choose between the United States and China. And that kind of attitude is actually still alive and very alive. And I also get the sense that given the situation in the South China Sea, regional states generally welcome U.S. engagement in the security realm, but do not want the U.S. government to push them to reject Chinese ICT equipment, for example, you know, equipment related to Huawei and so forth. I believe Prime Minister Lee of Singapore expressed uneasiness felt by Southeast Asian states with regard to the intensifying economic confrontation between the U.S. and China when he delivered remarks at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. So could you please explain to us, you know, how the intensified U.S.-China competition is impacting Southeast Asian states and, you know, how they are reacting to it or how they are viewing this competition? Thanks.
Thanks so much. And thank you all for being here. I'd also like to thank, of course, the G1 Institute and especially Hori-san for the opportunity to be here today. It's really wonderful. I very much like the idea of a G1 Institute or one global community. I think developments in the world today will just show us how far we are from, you know, being one global community, and it just makes the work of G1 all that more important, and what all of us are trying to do all that more important. So thank you. That said, I think it's important while we are seeking to build community to be absolutely honest about some of the challenges facing the region. And I think, you know, sometimes we have to be quite blunt in saying that, you know, when there are bad relations between countries, it's sometimes not that everyone is right, but some bad behavior is really causing problems. And in that respect, I feel like China has a bit of the short end of the stick, because even when it's trying to do things that could potentially help the region, like the Belt and Road Initiative, with its tremendous potential for infrastructure development and pulling countries out of poverty, some of its actions are problematic in the South China Sea, for instance. And so I think at the outset, I'd just like to highlight the fact that, you know, when we are trying to build this global community, it's not about just being pally-pally with everyone, but demanding certain standards of conduct to be maintained, and then after that behavior is maintained, then moving forwards to build greater trust and stability in the region. But on your question, thank you very much for the question, on how Southeast Asian countries are responding, I think it's very clear. It's no secret that Southeast Asian countries do not want to choose between the United States and China. And I think what it's trying to do right now is trying to hedge between the two superpowers. By and large, I think what they're trying to do is to broaden and deepen security ties with the United States, but also to try to strengthen the economic ties with China because of the economic potential it offers. Now, what intensifying US-China rivalry is doing is obviously narrowing the strategic space for Southeast Asian countries. And that's very problematic for these countries who already at the outset do not have all that much foreign policy independence and who struggle at being a small country in a very hotly contested region. The United States, or at least the Trump administration, insists that it isn't forcing Southeast Asian countries to choose. But I think if we look at, say, President Trump's comments on Huawei and how, he has insisted that that countries, both within Southeast Asia as well as outside of it, ban Huawei and other telecommunications equipment, I think that becomes clear that while he might not be explicitly saying you have to choose, that is the upshot of such statements, saying you should ban Huawei and other Chinese telecommunications equipment. In addition, if we look at what the United States and China are seeking to do now, decoupling the economies and technological spheres, I think the upshot of that as well is that, in effect, it would force the hands of Southeast Asian countries to choose sides, even though no explicit demands are made either by China or the United States. So what do Southeast Asian countries do then? I think their response should be, and Malaysia has talked about a third way or a middle way. Can we come to a sort of like a situation where we don't have to choose the United States or China, or can we be midway between them? I think actually how the region should be thinking about this very intractable problem is it should be thinking about not being pro-United States or pro-China, but pro-rule of law. Principles matter. The rule of law matters. And in seeking to determine how they should respond in a particular situation, I think countries in Southeast Asia should be seeking to reinforce a rules-based order which benefits both the smaller countries in the region, but as well the United States and China as well. And I think that's what we saw ASEAN countries do recently with the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And in that document, what ASEAN tried to do was to adopt the terminology of the Indo-Pacific, which is a US push, but also focus very much on principles and rules, as well as, like Japan, economics and connectivity. And in that document, it eschewed any mention of security cooperation or ties, as that might, be seen as containing China. And of course, Southeast Asian countries do not want that. So, but in the longer run, I think how Southeast Asian countries respond will largely depend on, how the United States responds and how much it shows itself to be a reliable ally and partner, but also how China responds in terms of offering up economic opportunity, but also keeping its behavior well within the rule of law.
Okay, thank you for those great points. Turning to Sanjay, could you please explain to us what US-China competition means for India? The tariff war is generally thought to have negative consequences for many countries, but from a strategic point of view, what kind of risks and perhaps opportunities does India see in the intensification of US-China rivalry?
Thank you. Let me at the outset thank G1 Institute and Hori-san for this invitation. Yes, US-China trade war has a significant impact on India, and it has significant implications. Why? Because one, United States is our largest trade partner, if you include goods and services, and it's also a strategic partner. The second is China is also one of the second most important trade partner for India. So when these two 800-pound gorillas contest with each other, it will have implications for all other countries in the region. And it has both positives, as you point out, and negatives for India. In terms of opportunities, we are looking at it whether it will increase strategic space for India, in the sense that if the trade war prolongs and becomes intensified, then China will have to look at alternative markets, which means they'll look at India for exports. We have our own concerns. We already have a huge trade deficit. Does that mean that tomorrow they will be much more willing to talk to India about our concerns? Because they have to go to new markets if this trade war intensifies. So that's one thing that we will be looking at. The other thing is Indian academics and others have been saying the trade deficit is not merely a consequence of efficiencies. It is also a consequence of state-led capitalism that is there in China. And that needs to be taken into account. Our argument over the years has been validated or is getting more amplified because of the ongoing US-China trade war. That with the way we look at Chinese trade practices needs much more closer examination. The other is the economic dimension of it. These are the political and the economic dimensions is that we are not linked. I mean, we don't have integrated supply chains with China. So therefore, the negative fallout has been limited. But we are looking at possibly some trade diversification that may happen. If the trade war intensifies, according to some research reports, there are 203 products that we can export in greater quantity to United States and about 153 other products to China, provided market access issues are worked out. The other is, of course, the investment dimensions of it. China has been an area or a space where a lot of investments will go in. And if US-China trade war is going to continue, it will have certain impact on the way investments flows are happening across the globe. In terms of challenges, one, if the global trade contracts because of the trade conflict, India's exports will also get hit. And we have to be ready for that. That's one of the challenges we have. And the other is this normalization of trade, punitive trade measures is becoming normalized in international politics. That is something that we need to keep in mind. Because, for instance, you take American language towards Indian trade issues. The US trade deficit with China is about $6 billion and, $378 billion, whereas India's trade deficit, US trade deficit with India is about $24 billion. But when some of the US policymakers speak about India and China together on trade issues, it looks a little out of place. We are not in the same league, yet we are compared together sometimes. And the other important thing that is happening is because of these punitive trade measures that both the countries are operationalizing and the fact that United States has stepped out of TPP, there is a movement towards regional economic orders, such as Regional Comprehensive Economic Initiative in Southeast Asia and larger East Asian region. That is a challenge for India. Why? Because we don't have an FTA with China, and yet our average trade deficit on an average in the last few years is about $50 billion. So participating in RCEP means FTA with China, and de facto FTA with China. So that's another challenge that we need to confront, because as countries move towards regional economic orders, there will be pressure on India to participate, even though it is going to impact negatively our industry. That is something that we need to work out. The final point that I would like to make is, if United States and China have a deal, what kind of deal will it be? That is something that we need to look at. Will it have mere bilateral consequences for United States and China, or will it open up market access within China? If that is the case, then it is good for India, because Indian software companies working in Beijing actually service American firms working in China. So that's the scale of challenges we are facing. And Indian pharma exports close to $4 billion to United States, whereas in China it sells only $40 million of pharmaceutical products. So that's a challenge for us. So how will China and United States, this whole trade war issue, pan out? And how will China look at this? Will it open up more, give more market access, make more friends? Will it be that kind of an approach? Then it's advantageous for us. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for those great insights. So, we did a sort of a rundown based on, major players up until here. So now I would like to sort of address the various aspects of the competition. And I just want to start off with the sort of military dimension of the competition by asking a question for Abe. Many observers have pointed out that at the heart of the current so-called trade war is a technological competition that is unfolding between the US and China. And the US government is pursuing a very comprehensive set of measures to curb Chinese access to US technology through various means. And I think China, on the other hand, is advancing what is being called military-civil fusion strategy that aims to exploit dual-use technologies for military-industrial purposes. Do you think the US approach to curb and limit technological interdependence between the United States and China is necessary and would help the United States achieve its policy objectives, whatever that, there may be several, but do you think it would help achieve US goals? And based on your extensive experience at the US Department of Defense, would you like to perhaps focus on the military implications of the technological competition? And please tell us your views on what kind of risks you foresee and what should be done to manage those risks associated with the military technological competition.
About 90 seconds. I think for any competition, it's not just in the military technical piece. There's two aspects to any competition. There's the aspect where you try to slow the other side down, and there's this aspect where you try to speed yourself up. And to be honest, I sense that between the United States and China, for the United States, we're going to be more successful if we speed ourselves up. So I think just as a general tool, as a general sense, a lot of our ability to successfully compete with China will depend on our ability to offer a compelling alternative to China, be it in infrastructure, be it in 5G, be it in all these technical pieces that you mentioned. In terms of keeping some Chinese technologies out, the only points I would make there is that China's structural approach to some of these technologies puts the United States in a position that prejudices us towards keeping them out. And what I mean by that is by integrating civil and military technology, it means that the United States cannot engage with some of China's highest technology firms without engaging the Chinese military. That if we're transferring technology to a Chinese corporation, we understand that fundamentally those technologies could go to the PLA, and that those companies are not controlled by shareholders, not driven by the market, but rather controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so because of the structural decision that Beijing made in this region, in this issue, it's putting the United States in position to err on the side of caution to keep some of those technologies out, and I think in a very reasonable way. Similarly, in terms of technologies, I think China has decoupled itself in some important areas. So a Chinese person cannot access Facebook, cannot access Twitter, cannot access all of these pieces of pretty otherwise universal technology areas because of their own decisions. So I think there's aspects where it makes sense for the United States to say, in this area, we do not want China to be part of our network. We don't want Huawei to be on some sensitive networks or whatever that may be. I think that makes sense as long as there's a good purpose for it. I think there's other aspects that need to be addressed that haven't been. For example, if we're going to protect our networks from Huawei, as example, if we see Huawei as a fundamental threat to the security of our networks, then we can't just look at US infrastructure. We need to look at the infrastructure of our allies and our partners. Yet the Trump administration has not engaged with those allies and partners in a comprehensive way, so that you have some countries like Australia, Japan, having one policy, other countries like the UK and France, Germany having another policy. And so that means that we're never going to have a clean network. In terms of traditional military technological competition, the traditional understanding of it is that you build a thing, I build something that's better, you'll build something that's better than that. That's been going on since the beginning of warfare, since the beginning of humanity, and I don't think it's going to stop. And it's something that the United States has been watching for a long time. I used to be the lead drafter on the Pentagon's public report about the PLA. And if you can look back and watch the United States' understanding of the PLA evolve over time through these annual reports. And there was a report just recently that I think gives you an idea of how this has changed. In 2009, China had roughly 100 missiles that could strike US bases in Japan. Today it's about 1,000. And so as China develops these military capabilities, I think it makes sense for the United States to adjust its approach, to defend itself, to defend its allies, to assert its interests. So when the United States starts putting more forces into the South China Sea or the East China Sea, it removes itself from the INF treaty in order to be able to respond to China's evolving challenge, I don't think it's terribly surprising. And I think it's actually it's a fair move, but I think there's a lot more that would be done in terms of competition in the military technical piece, but I think that gives you an example about how this military technical competition, I think, is going to play out.
Great, great. Thank you very much for that. Turning to the economic dimension now, Dao-Zhong, could you perhaps talk to us about some of the economic issues related to the U.S.-China competition? It has been reported that the U.S.-China trade talks are addressing issues like China's import expansion from the U.S., forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, state-backed investments, and so forth. And one of the major sticking points has been said to be China's state subsidies for Chinese industries. And some observers have pointed out the Chinese government would never compromise on state subsidies since shutting down state subsidies would have not only economic consequences, but huge political consequences for Mr. Xi and probably the Chinese Communist Party. So do you think it is possible or even preferable for China to reduce state subsidies and shift to a sort of a more market-driven economy in the mid to long term? And if so, how do you think that kind of fundamental economic reform could be undertaken by China? And what would be your proposal for managing this kind of U.S.-China economic competition? So I would appreciate your views on that, those questions. Thanks.
Before I go to that, let me make a quick observation about this Huawei business. This is not new. We had this with Australia before anybody noticed this, 2002, 2001. You have a difference between the equipment and the management. And you also have this hardcore capacity to test the equipment. Of course, the producer and its government behind it, what else, should make that testing available. I don't quite get the anguish or the ideology behind all this. It's sort of like the sport of water, You can tell me it was made with this or that intent, it was meant to poison me, so long as I can have it tested. Then I have a way of making judgment. So let me leave it there. Now, no suspicions, worries, that's fine. But sometimes we also live in the real common sense world. Now, regarding the question about state-owned subsidies, capitalism, you have 2 or 3 versions of capitalism. One is textbook capitalism, one is practice. And if you look at state subsidies, then you think about negative interest rates, which is now an in thing, right? According to most traditional economics textbooks. That's not very capitalist. Negative interest rates is a form of subsidy. When you talk about the state in the economy, I often ask my American friends, they don't always like me, For example, Lockheed Martins and Boeing are in one now. Where is the state? Where's the market? So it's not always as clear-cut. That does not necessarily mean that we don't have room to cut our slack over there in China. But the state-owned enterprise as a tradition in the Chinese history actually goes back to the pre-war era. The Chinese modality for running SOEs, it actually comes from Japanese language, the danwei. And this was, the civilian aspect of the Japanese presence in China from the 1910s to 1940s. And no matter what, that was our history, right? We inherited this, and then you go with a textbook approach of Big Bang, should we say, as was tried in Russia and some of the East and Central Europe. Then you are left with, uncertainties. You have observed that where that approach that was tried. But in any case, the SOE reform is a very complex matter. It needs to be done. But I would challenge the notion that the SOE is just there for the sake of the Communist Party. Again, we go back to what I would think sometimes we pose this dichotomy too sharply, too theoretically. You may not want to call it a Communist Party. You can change the name, but at the end of the day, you need to have entities, economic entities that don't do something for the greater public good, rather than saying everything is the investors' profits, maximization of that profit, and you need that profit now, you need it right away, and you need that profit to shift to wherever the maximization goes.
Okay, thank you. Next, if I may ask Lynn about the maritime dimension of the competition. Recently we've been seeing, countries like US, Japan, Australia, UK, and France increase their maritime presence in the South China Sea. And certain countries have been conducting so-called freedom of navigation operations. But we haven't really seen a sort of a long-term South China Sea strategy. I'm not sure what that is. And I was wondering, where we are headed at, because China is building all these military facilities in the South China Sea over these artificial islands. And, countries are also increasing their maritime presence to assert their rights under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So I would also welcome your thoughts on what should be done to manage potential risks that could emanate from this kind of situation, and what kind of future do you see for the South China Sea?
Thank you for that question. Just a brief background for those in the room who might not be completely cognizant of the issue. I think all of you would know from news reports that from about late 2013, China started building huge fortresses in the South China Sea. By about 2017, China had operational naval and air facilities on these features. By 2018, China was militarizing these features. So it's been quite a quick succession of rather intimidating events. China says that this is purely defensive, and it has a right to build on these facilities as it likes because it's sovereign territory. But the fact of the matter is that these territories are hotly contested. And in the case of at least one of them, an international tribunal has found to be clearly within Philippines' sovereignty. So that's the background in terms of the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. But there's also been greater Chinese encroachments in terms of the exclusive economic zones of coastal states. So I think in the last month or so, we've seen China send seismic activity vessels into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. And Vietnam has been protesting loudly, but there's very little Vietnam can do. China has also sent hundreds of vessels to swarm Philippines' occupied territories in the it's called T2 Island, and there were hundreds of vessels in the first half of this year to coerce and intimidate. So the reaction from some of these middle powers, France, the UK, Australia, Japan, in terms of either what the US calls freedom of navigation operations, but I prefer to call assertions of maritime rights and freedoms. These assertions of maritime rights and freedoms are terribly important because I think what it does is that although it doesn't roll back any of the militarization of features or building on these features, what it does do is that it prevents China from controlling vast spaces in the South China Sea. So it prevents China from making the South China Sea into a Chinese lake. The other thing that's really important is that it sends an important message that countries apart from the United States actually care about a rules-based order. And this isn't completely, although I think there's an element in that, this isn't completely about US-China rivalry, but it's about keeping the rules of the road safe so that everyone can use the road. And I think that's terribly important. You talked about a long-term strategy. So what sort of long-term strategy should we have? I think, number one, countries have to continue with these assertions of maritime rights and freedoms. Very important. Number two, countries have to continue with their joint military exercises in the international waters of the South China Sea. And why do I say that that's important? Because China, along with the 10 Southeast Asian countries, are negotiating a code of behavior code of conduct for the South China Sea. And in that, China is trying to get countries to agree to prevent third countries from having military exercises with any of the littoral states in the South China Sea. It's also seeking to prevent foreign companies from outside Southeast Asia or from China from working with Southeast Asian countries to develop their exclusive economic zone. So that kind of really disadvantages the coastal states in the nation who depend on oil and gas, but also fishing resources in the South China Sea. But I think more broadly, I think countries need to think about how, apart from using, a more assertive stance to uphold the rule of law, how can persuasion be brought to bear into the issue? Now, I think China has every interest in following a rules-based order, in particular the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in the South China Sea, because this actually benefits maritime powers. And if we look at history, if we look at the Soviet Union's experience with the law of the sea, the Soviet Union initially had a pretty similar approach to the law of the sea as China does. It was worried about incursions from other powers, and it wanted to limit rather than preserve some of these maritime rights and freedoms. But as the Soviet Union became a stronger naval power, and as it had increasing interests that spanned the globe, the Soviet Union joined hands with the United States to seek to preserve the rights and freedoms that are now enshrined in the Law of the Sea Convention that has been signed on to by 160 or so states. So I think in the longer run, there needs to be greater persuasion of seeking good behavior, both on the part of China, but also the United States. The trade war is a disaster. I think both sides need to be persuaded to have their better angels rule.
Okay, thank you for all that. My last question to the panel, Sanjay, goes to Sanjay. And the United States, Japan, and other states have been trying to define the way they plan to engage the region through their respective Indo-Pacific strategy. And China, on the other hand, is advancing its famous Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. And I've heard that India is cautious about the BRI and the expansion of Chinese economic and military presence in the region more generally. So, could you perhaps explain to us what kind of role India would play under these circumstances where you have this geopolitical competition over influence in third countries between US and China? And I would appreciate if you could also discuss what India should be doing in the midst of this US-China geopolitical competition.
Thank you. Yes, there are many conceptions of Indo-Pacific. For instance, United States has its own conception of Indo-Pacific, which extends from Bay of Bengal to the west coast of United States. Japan has its own conception of Indo-Pacific. India has its own conception. Japanese and Indian conception of Indo-Pacific overlap. These divergences in conceptualization is okay because we are democracies and we conceptualize things differently. Belt and Road Initiative initially started off as one belt, one road, only one conception. But now it has been redefined into Belt and Road Initiative, and we have some reservations on that. What are our reservations? One, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is an integral part of Belt and Road Initiative, goes through an Indian territory, which is currently held by Pakistan. So that is our reservation. Second is the question of consultativeness. That is, when OBOR, or Belt and Road Initiative, was conceptualized and released, a map was released, Calcutta was shown as one of the ports. Who was consulted? So that's an important dimension. And the other dimension related to that is people often say, think out of box and explore the possibilities of collaboration. For that, we need to know the box. What is the box? I mean, take China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The framework agreement has not been released publicly, as far as I know, till the last time I checked. And what we see is only press leakages in Pakistani newspapers. So when there is no box, how do you think out of box in cooperating on Belt and Road Initiative? That's a challenge that we have. The other is market dynamics. We have been saying that, look, there is possibilities of debt crisis, and many of these projects are not driven by market dynamics, and our concerns have been proved right. If you default with World Bank, IMF, they don't come and take your territory, but here, Hambantota and others, territory is being taken over. On your question of, on lease, of course, on your question, what should India do? As the title of the session says, China-US hegemony. I think we are becoming increasingly multipolar, and the capacity of two countries to define the ideational space or the politics of ideas is decreasing. And that's where India and Japan need to cooperate and think differently and act differently. And probably reforming Security Council is one step forward in that direction. And the other thing that I would like to say here is we should move away from focusing just on China and United States. There are a host of other countries, such as Japan and India. We are working in developing connectivity networks. How do we coordinate in third countries? We have opened a pipeline into Nepal to reduce pollution and also reduce the prices of oil that is going into Nepal. Japan's ODA can be constructed around that in Nepal for our advantage and mutual advantage. So that is one of the ways in which we can look at. The same thing probably can be other democracies can look at. Other democracies focus a lot on non-democracies in terms of giving ODA. But when we deploy ODA in our immediate neighborhood in democracies, can we coordinate? Yes, there need not be a rigid one plan. But if India is doing something, what is it that other democracies can pitch in with? Probably that's one way of looking at in terms of developing connectivity networks. As democracies, we will not have a single plan, but we can coordinate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to open up the floor. Since time flies and we only have 7 minutes and 30 seconds, I'm going to exercise my prerogative. Collect 2 questions. I'm sorry about that, but collect 2 questions, yes. And then have the panelists respond. And when you ask a question, please make clear who you want to direct the question to. So please, gentleman over there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the panel. I'll try to keep this quick. So I think we spent a lot talking about the last 40 years and also kind of near-term initiatives and cooperation and challenges that we have in the oceans around us in Asia. My question is around 40 years from now. What might be kind of predictions around the way that this all, either if it settles, if it's still the conversation is really much between US and China, or if there are kind of third countries that come into the picture, if China is not the same type of government that it is right now, if world powers are kind of working in different ways. So I'm kind of curious. I feel like US and China answers may be a little bit biased to their in backgrounds or expected outcomes. So maybe if either Lynn or Sanjay could give your opinion. I'd be curious to hear from everybody, but if I had to say. Like predictions for 40 years from now in terms of what the geopolitical landscape will look like. And I recognize this is on the record, so maybe just what people in your field think may be potential outcomes as opposed to your personal opinion.
Hello. This question is to Abraham. I would like to have your comments on the agreement made in 2017 between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump for the US-Japan Partnership on infrastructure investment in third countries. How would you think that agreement would be important as opposed to one road, one belt?
How would the world be in 40 years in geopolitical context? I don't know. It's very difficult to define. But I would say hopefully we won't lose territory due to submergence because of climate change and the melting of polar caps. If that doesn't happen, I'm very happy with it. Thank you.
I think we can't make predictions for 40 years into the future, and unfortunately I left my crystal ball at home. But what I can say is that I don't know how many of you read these books when you were a child, Choose Your Own Adventure, where you choose route A and you get to outcome B, and if you choose route C, you get to outcome D. And I think how we choose at this point of time is going to make a huge difference to the geopolitical landscape 40 years from now. We can talk about technology, etc. But fundamentally, how are relations between states going to be governed? I think what we're going to see for sure is a slightly more multipolar world, but how relations between states will be managed, whether it's a rules-based, whether it's about the rule of law, the rule of might, I think that will depend on the decisions we make today. And I don't think that outcome is clear yet. So I think it's quite hard to say which way we're going into the future. But it's an interesting question. Thank you.
In terms of the infrastructure development agreement between the United States and Japan, I think broadly speaking, it's a very positive development for the United States and Japan to work together on infrastructure. I think it could be broadened to include countries like India, Australia. But I think it's a mistake to see things as competitive with China. That in terms of dollar for dollar, matching what China announces as BRI is not terribly efficient, doesn't make a lot of sense. I think our core advantage and where we should focus is in terms of quality. That we deliver what we say, that it's good quality, that it's done with good practices, that it supports, that actually accomplishes what we set out to, that it's not exploitative, good environmental impact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this to me speaks to the broader question of asking countries, trying to encourage countries to choose sides. I think that's actually ultimately an unsuccessful strategy for the United States and for China, to be honest. I think the objective that the United States should support is to encourage countries to be able to make their own decisions, free from coercion. Because I have confidence in the American system and the Japanese system that in an open competition, where transparency exists, where the rule of law exists, in an open competition between an American proposal with its allies and partners and a Chinese proposal, I think we're going to win that competition more than we lose it. And I have that confidence in our system. But it requires that transparency, it requires that direct competition, and it requires those countries to be able to make those decisions free from external coercion.
Okay, great, thank you. Dajon, would you like to
Yeah, I want
add
to
on?
say something about 40 years from today. We have all this. There's something that's already happening in China that began to happen in Japan some 30 years ago, but that warning was not probably taken that seriously in this country. That was a demographic change. The same thing is happening in China, and we may be one of those few nations that get old before we get rich. And likewise, in terms of immigration policies, and I think one of the things, whether it's communist or you talk about clash of civilizations or whatnot, China stands a better chance of winning the hearts and minds of people around the world by making the Chinese society a place for people of all different races, different religions, or different political beliefs to come and try their hands, to thrive and get a job, or if they want to choose to settle. So the next 40 years, in that sense, we need to be open, not just in terms of ideas, the real actions, clean up our environment so that people actually like to come. And we took a baby step, still a baby step, 2017, of creating a separate Bureau of Immigration. And hopefully we can start working much faster to make migration from outside world into China a lot easier. The worst mistake China could make moving into the next 40 years, given the diaspora aspect of Chinese history or Chinese civilization, is to somehow project or let others conclude, and we do nothing, with the image that China is just a place occupying that vast continent for ethnic or racial or culturally or by blood Chinese only. That would be a very, very, very destructive mistake for China.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So it seems that we are time's up. It says time's up. So please join me in thanking all the panelists. I think we had a great, lots of fruitful thought on this issue. Thank you very much.